Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
For 8-year-old Randy, dragging his fishing pole to the neighborhood storm drain was just another typical day. He ignored the quiet rumble in his stomach as he looped monofilament line through the eyelets and retrieved a hook from the confines of his tackle box. Bad times had fallen upon the family. A freak cold front had greatly disturbed conditions in the bay, sending the native ladyfish and black drum scattering for warmer, more bountiful waters. No fish meant no food. With his father on a days-long excursion in the sandhills hunting for wild boar, and with his mother left at home to nurse his 6-month-old brother, Randy had taken it upon himself to bring home bread. Or, in this case, fish. The storm drains were an open secret in the town of Hell's Gulf. Heavy rains would flood over the neighboring wetlands and wash out fish into the man-made pipes. There, isolated in darkness with a steady supply of food in the form of bugs, trash, and waste, the fish could simply sit there in the little pools and grow fat. One could trudge through miles of grasses and longleaf pines and throw a line into the sprawling swamps hoping to tempt a fish onto the hook. Or one could walk 15 feet up the street, drop it down one of those man-made fissures in the sidewalk, and give it a few seconds. Despite the ease of this endeavor, Randy still fidgeted with nerves. He had swiped the last of the hot dogs from the fridge to use as bait. A stringer loaded with fish would be more substantial than 2.5 links, but he understood the mathematics of his calculated risk. If output, O, equaled less than input, I, then he'd be royally fucked. He removed a link from its packaging and coughed at the stench. It was a few days past its printed expiration date, smelly enough to lure in a fish. He stuck a slice of hot dog onto the hook and flipped it down the storm drain. A solid plop of an object hitting water followed. He waited. Something tugged on the line, and Randy set the hook with such vigor that he yanked his prize straight out of the storm drain and onto the road. A bullhead catfish, no longer than his hand, flopped about on the asphalt. Randy smiled as he grasped it, avoiding its nail-like spines, and tossed it in his bucket. A half dozen or so more like that, they'd have dinner for the night. He could already taste the breaded, deep-fried goodness. He had scarcely baited his hook again and dropped it down when he felt another tug. "Gosh darn, I got me the honey hole," he exclaimed as he set the hook. A sudden surge that nearly tore the rod from his grasp, and the line snapped. Randy stared blankly at his limp, inert fishing pole. Even he knew the big fish struggled for at least a moment before making cotton fiber splinters of his gear. Something else was down there. Something that wasn't a fish. His first thought was an alligator. Randy had seen them basking on the banks of cattle ponds, but he had never been allowed to get near them. Now, however, with the storm drain several feet deep, he assumed he was at a safe height. Randy lowered onto his belly and crawled forward, keeping a death grip on the sidewalk. His head barely fit through the opening in the street. Just a little peek, just to catch a glimpse of this gator. Then he'd clear out and move on. He swore to God. It was a peculiar sensation. From the shoulders down, he felt rough, sun-baked asphalt, but from the neck up registered a cool, black void. The storm drain stank of mold and bad water, hissing with the flow of air. Randy remembered reading about how one's pupils had to adjust to low light, so he closed his eyes, counting silently to himself. 6, 7, 8. The sound of the flowing current was oddly relaxing. 18, 19, 20. Randy opened his eyes. Something was staring back. His heart hadn't the chance to jump before it leapt up and sank its tusks into his skull. That brief, violent spark of agony was the last thing he knew before darkness settled. The crowd gasped and retched when they pulled the boy's body from underneath the storm drain. They had expected resistance once they reached his head. They all knew how much children loved getting their heads stuck in places they didn't belong. Staircase banisters, the slats of a chair, pet doors, etc. But his neck emerged from the fissure cleanly. Just his neck. That image seared itself into the minds of the onlookers. Such grotesquely jagged geometry. Flaps and slivers of skin like wrapping paper. Folded textures of coagulated flesh like ground beef. The protruding fragments of bone like shards of ivory glass. It was incongruous. Unholy. The human body ought not to have been denigrated in such a way. The inner workings on full display, so broken and unseemly. He didn't stay out in the open for long, for a shroud was thrown over the body and was immediately shipped off to the sheriff's office. The shroud only came off in the cold room, under the sober eye of Dr. Hall and Sheriff Hank Crowley.
Damn.
The sheriff muttered, shaking his head.
Kid probably didn't feel nothing.
Morbid to think about, but you're right.
Said Dr. Hall, probing the headless stump with a pair of forceps.
Way too clean to have been much of a fight. And the lack of abrasions on the skin imply the victim didn't even struggle. One quick strike, over with.
An ambush.
Crowley mused.
From the sewer? Gotta be a gator. I heard they got them sewer gators up in New York City.
Doubt it.
Dr. Hall replied.
Even if a gator could jump that high, the trauma is unlike one.
He waved a gloved hand near the cadaver's neck.
A gator would rip off a limb, or head in this case, by grabbing on and twisting in a death roll. I'd expect to see contortion of the flesh, a dislodged vertebra. But this is a clean bite. Something was powerful enough to crush right through the skull and just take it off. Like plucking fruit from a vine.
The doctor shuddered.
What else we got round here then?
Asked Crowley.
Bears? Panthers?
Potentially.
The doctor reflected.
In a storm drain, though? Not quite their MO.
Commotion rose up outside the cold room. The sounds of a scuffle, of aggravated men's voices. But they couldn't drown out the woman screaming.
Let me see him! Let me see my baby!
The doctor and sheriff looked away, sighing. The frosted glass window only showed murky shadows, but the chaos and heartbreak beyond the room painted an impossibly ugly picture.
They killed my boy! Oh God, why? Haven't they taken enough from this godforsaken town?
People are gonna start talking,
Dr. Hall said ominously, retreating to a quiet corner away from the turmoil.
They're gonna bring up that old wives' tale again.
Old wives' tales be damned.
Crowley muttered, trailing him.
I don't see how they're gonna pin this to anything else but the
clamor outside silenced with a gunshot. Crowley sprung into action, drawing his pistol and bursting out the door into the main room. The foyer was in complete disarray. Papers had been flung off the desk and random townsfolk were scattered all around. 3 of them were holding back Mrs. Duluth, whose face was red and shiny from crying. The gunman stood in the front doorway, but he had already set his rifle upon the ground. Everyone was turned towards him. Crowley even lowered his own weapon, realizing the shot had just been to grab their attention.
I know what it did,
Mr. Duluth said in a shaky voice. He stumbled into the station, white as a ghost. He clutched something in his fist.
I was going after its kin in the woods just this morning. It knew. It wanted to make us pay.
He unfurled his fingers. In his palm was a clump of wiry hairs.
It was the fucking werepig that killed my boy.
It only took a few hours to assemble the hunting party. Such was the conviction, that cursed word, werepig. The beast was a local legend in Hell's Gulf, allegedly responsible for decades-long string of brutal killings. Only one had ever been clearly seen on a moonlit July night on the beach nearly 40 years earlier, where it had massacred 6 men before finally succumbing to enough shotgun blasts to take down a bull. The sole surviving witness described a hunched, pig-skinned monstrosity with a broad snout and bulbous tusks. But that was all he got out before he finally bled out townsfolk's arms. For the decades following, however, the creature had remained elusive, the only evidence of its presence in the form of mutilated bodies strewn throughout town's various haunts. But with the killing of Randy Duluth, they had a lead. A plausible explanation as to how the werepig could slip in and out of sight like a murderous phantom.
Damn thing's been running around right under our feet,
Gus remarked, glaring down the storm drain.
These tunnels must crisscross for miles.
Yanni muttered.
Werepig could go anywhere.
then find a nice little hidey hole to stash its meat,
said Brom.
Please,
Mr. Duluth growled.
let's not refer to my boy as meat.
Sorry, Stephen.
Brom muttered.
Where does the storm drain let out?
Sebastian asked, flanked by his twin brother Jerome.
Just south of the bay.
Gus answered, waving his hand vaguely southward.
Might be wise to set up a perimeter at the spillway, in case we flush it out down that way.
Flush it out.
Jerome echoed.
Wait, you saying we going in the sewers?
Storm drains, there's a difference.
Gus corrected.
Yeah, the only crap you'll see is from Jiry tossing his bags of poodle shit down there.
Said Brom.
And maybe from Jiry himself from that one time he got drunk. Those 2 times.
3.
10, I reckon.
Nah, we not going underground.
Said Jerome, backing up.
Even if there is something down there, we not gonna put ourselves in its den.
This thing has killed a lot of folk over a lot of years.
Yanni retorted.
Now we got the edge over it and you want to back out? Besides, you two said you'd help us.
We had our fingers crossed,
said Sebastian, holding up a hand and demonstrating.
No, you didn't.
We saw your hands.
They were crossed in spirit.
Sebastian offered.
Blow it out your asses then.
Yanni jeered, brushing them off.
We can do this without you two bums.
Well, hey, I just remembered we're doing a huge sale on carnations down at the bait shop,
said Jerome, walking off.
Get them now while you can. I think a lot of mourners gonna be needing them soon.
Get out of here.
Brom leered.
Come on, Sebby. Let's leave these crackpots to their death wish.
Jerome beckoned, stomping off down the street. Sebastian shrugged before following his brother.
Good riddance,
Brom commented. He turned to address the gathering bystanders.
Meanwhile, the rest of us who care so deeply for our dead children, we're gonna go down there and we're gonna bring back the fucking werepig's head on a stick.
Crowd applauded, whooping and pumping their fists. The hunting party strapped on their weapons, machetes, hatchets, and knives. Firearms ran the risk of igniting noxious vapors in the drains and barbecuing the men like stuck werepigs.
God bless, friends,
a voice in the crowd called out.
Watch your sixes,
another advised.
Avenge your boy,
a third shouted.
1, 2, heave!
The party looped a rope through the manhole cover and dislodged it, dragging it across the concrete and setting it down. One by one, Gus, Yanni, and Braum, and Stephen Duluth descended down the ladder, the crowd cheering them on. The four gathered in the cramped catch basin, barely tall enough for them to stand up. The air was dim and heavy with a subterranean musk. The water was ankle deep, cool to the touch, even through their thick rubber of the waders. The exposed manhole cover above formed a spotlight in the chamber, illuminating the dried slick of blood trailing from the opening. Stephen's gaze was averted.
Let's go. Come on. Please.
In silence, the men turned on their headlamps and lowered themselves to a crouch, shuffling through the inlet-outlet pipe. Within moments, they arrived at an intersection in the pipe. Arbitrarily, Gus, the front-runner, turned left. And with that, the light and sounds of the world above were extinguished. All that lay ahead was the dank labyrinth. Each footstep sent eerie echoes crawling down the pipe interior. Dripping water sent subtle plinking sounds through the corridor. The musty odor was everywhere, to the point where the men had tied cloth masks around their faces to block out the miasma. For 15 minutes, the men trudged in silence, the pipe never allowing them enough height to do more than hunch over.
Anyone else think this venture was made a mite hasty?
Braum finally said.
Yeah, but no way I was involved in this, Sheriff.
Gus answered.
Permits and regulations and whatnot. Trail would have run cold long before we ever got permission.
The hell are you talking about?
Braum snapped.
What trail? We're just walking right now. We don't even know where in town we're under.
Well, I know we're near water.
Yanni commented.
Oh, shut up, smartass.
Make me dick fuck.
We're downstream of Gordo's.
A voice from the back said. The three men up front turned to address Stephen, who had plucked a soggy hamburger wrapper from the floor.
This here's the same wrapping he uses. There's a grate in the street just outside his diner.
And sure enough, a few paces up, bars of sunlight wafted through a grate in the ceiling overhead another catch basin. The party made their way to the open space and straightened up, stretching their strained backs.
All right,
Braum said.
So now we got our bearings, but that leaves us no closer to the werepig.
Damn thing probably smelled us and scampered.
Yanni said darkly.
Stephen, didn't you say you were hunting hogs in the sandhills?
Yeah,
he replied.
It was a revenge killing. They took Randy from me.
Then maybe we ought to head east towards the woods. Maybe it thinks that-a-way's safe.
Braum reasoned.
Better than what we've got.
Gus agreed.
These pipes aren't that straightforward,
said Gus.
Come on, first chance we get, we turn east.
They crossed the basin and entered the pipe leading north, back inside the cramped darkness.
Shh, you hear that?
Party stopped. So suddenly the silence seemed to roar back into place. But the new noises were quick to be heard. The sounds of splashing somewhere up the pipe.
Lights off,
Gus whispered, and blackness overtook them. Ahead was a lone bluish glimmer from another catch basin.
Not a sound,
he hissed, and the four men crept forward in a beeline through the pipe. The sloshing became louder. Whatever it was big, and seeming to enjoy itself, like a kid having fun at the pool. The convoy arrived at the end of the pipe. A lone sunbeam illuminated the basin before them as they crowded around each other, silently to look. The beast was wallowing in the flooded chamber, snorting and grunting, the smell of wet animal billowing off of it. It stuck its snout into the water, snuffing about for a moment before striking and lifting its head. Bullhead struggled in its maw before it was crushed and swallowed whole. The convoy watched it with disgust. It was a run-of-the-mill wild boar, an uncommon sight in the sandhills, but recognizable nonetheless. Townsfolk had learned to let them be, as they could be lethal when aggressive, and the hogs, for the most part, left them alone in turn, apart from raiding the occasional dumpster. They couldn't speak for a half-man, half-pig abomination, though, and the presence of a plain old hog in the storm drains was perplexing regardless. Its noisy shuffling blotted out the men's voices.
Young'un,
Gus whispered.
Was it what killed the boy?
Brom asked.
Can't be,
said Gus.
This hog's too small to fit a kid's whole head in its mouth.
Shh, shut up,
Yanni urged, nudging Gus. Behind them, Stephen remained silent.
Can't let him stay down here, though,
said Brom.
What do you say we do the Brant technique?
Sounds dandy.
Yanni agreed, unsheathing his Bowie knife.
Back me up, boys. I did get bronze in that contest.
It was pewter, actually,
Brom muttered. But they shifted aside so Yanni could crawl forward, knife clutched in his teeth. He went low and quiet, like a leopard about to pounce. The boar's rear was turned towards him as it continued foraging through the drain water.
My blade thirsts for blood, boys,
he declared before pouncing. The man tackled the boar from behind, squeezing it with his arms and legs and bringing it to the ground. It squealed and thrashed, sending water up the entire height of the catch basin, splashing the other three men in the face.
Hooey!
Yanni whooped, spitting the blade from his mouth and catching it with his free hand. But the weakened grip gave the slick, slippery hog a chance. It surged forward, dislodging from Yanni, who fell face first into the water and barreled off down an eastward pipe, its hoofbeats like a rainstorm.
Oh, no, you don't,
Yanni cried, brandishing his knife and taking off after it.
Get back here, you pork-bellied son of a bitch!
His fading bellows became ghostly and dim until he too disappeared within the pipe.
Yanni!
Gus cried.
You stupid ass, don't...
But he sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose.
Whatever. Just let him at it.
The three emerged from the pipe into the basin, watching and waiting for Yanni to return, hopefully smeared with the blood of his porcine victim. The tunnel was slippery, and Yanni nearly lost his footing several times, but the conditions ensured the hog, whose hooves were even more poorly adept, couldn't get too far ahead. I gotcha, you fucker, Yanni growled, the light from his headlamp bobbing in front of him, passing over the boar's hindquarters on occasion. Eventually, the pipe ended at a left-right intersection. Yanni had by then lost sight of it, but the hog's frantic noises were emanating from the right side.
Not a chance,
he huffed, turning down the tunnel in pursuit. As he surged forward, gravity pulled at him. The pipe was sloping downward. Invigorated, he quickened the pace, half running, half falling down the pipe. Then it dropped away entirely, and he plummeted for a dizzying half-second onto hard, damp concrete.
Shitfire!
He swore, wringing out his sprained palms. He quickly recovered his knife and reoriented his headlamp to examine the space around him. It was much wider than the pipe he had emerged from, yet still not tall enough to stand in. Multiple pipe openings led into the cistern, some of which were actively gushing water. And the room was jam-packed with hogs. At least 24 of them, twice as large as the young'un he had chased. So tall, their bristly backs scraped the ceiling. Yanni's headlamp cast harsh light and psychotic shadows across their milky eyes, their wet, slobbering gums, their shiny, blood-stained tusks. As one, they turned their great ugly heads towards him. A growling rumble rose up, their teeth bared. They stamped at the ground. 3 tons of tusk, muscle, and maw converged.
Quiet! You hear that?
Back in the catch basin, a crashing noise was echoing down the eastward pipe.
Stay back,
Brom said curtly, approaching the opening and aiming his headlamp down the tunnel. For a moment, he was silent, hands forming a brim over his eyes to try and see further into the pipe's depths. Then he saw it.
Oh, shit!
He spat.
Scatter!
Stephen leapt back into the southward pipe they had emerged from. Gus and Brom took the opposite way. The noise became a crashing thunder, concentrated through the acoustics of the eastward pipe like a succession of bullets. They poured from the pipe, a squealing, screaming herd of giant, devilish hogs, forming a swirling cyclone in the crowded basin, piling up and over each other in their manic urge to charge. Hair and water and saliva exploded from the fray. The chaos drowned out the three men's hysterical cursing. The sheer number of hogs rose like a flood. They were on level with the rest of the pipes. Some climbed their way inside, surging forward, hungry for blood.
Run, goddammit!
Gus hollered, and the men turned tail and bolted. Stephen lost track of where he was, who he was. All that concerned him was putting as much distance between the encroaching, furious mob of pigs as he could. He took turns down the pipes at random, whatever bearings he'd gathered left behind at the catch basin. His headlamp beam bounced chaotically ahead of him, pumping up and down with his heaving chest. Underneath his clattering footsteps and rhythmic breathing, the sound of beastly mayhem approached. He took another left turn. A disk of daylight stood at the far end of the tunnel. Stephen gave an involuntary whoop of excitement, coursing through the pipe at top speed. A hog's squeal pierced the air behind him. It, too, sounded excited.
You ain't getting me too, you sons of bitches.
Stephen gasped. The encroaching hoofbeats were a death march. The concentrated noises were forcing Stephen's hair on end, blasting up the back of his neck like hot air. He burst out into the blinding sunshine, straightening up in the open space. He cursed. Yes, he was outside again. But it was a concrete pit with a metal grate over its opening to prevent people getting into the drains.
Or getting out,
he rued. The pursuing beasts were closer than ever. Stephen looked across the pit. There was another pipe opening he could crawl through. But his moment's worth of hesitation had cost him dearly. No way he could outpace the hogs now. He glanced up. The grate was beyond his reach, but only just beyond, and the bar seemed wide enough to squeeze through. He jumped, grasping a bar with one hand. His feet dangled and kicked in the air. Tantalizing treat for any passing hog.
No,
he huffed, tensing his arms and swinging his legs.
You ain't gonna get me too.
Energy spiked through his body, and he found the strength to haul himself up. The sides of his head strained as it pushed through the metal bars, and he nearly lost his grasp, thinking about what his son might have endured. That sudden pressure around his skull, and then nothing. His shoulders were through, then his ribs. Stephen slid up through the bars, sunlight drenching his body as he rolled away from the grate onto the surface. From the pipe below, two snarling, snapping, squealing heads emerged, jamming the entryway like some chimeric hellbeast. Then they broke through, and the pit filled with hogs. They sprung onto their hind legs, jamming their snouts between the bars, tongues rolling and tusks clashing. But even they couldn't break through the reinforced steel. Stephen simply turned and ran, not granting them the snowball's chance in hell to catch him. Finally, when his soul returned to his body, he stopped and gave himself the opportunity to look around.
God damn it,
he panted.
Where am I?
Far away underground, Gus was having a worse time of it.
Brom!
He hollered, having fallen behind.
God damn it, where are you at?
He knew Brom was far ahead, his heavy footsteps and a sliver of light occasionally making themselves known. But it wouldn't be for long before Gus stopped at a four-way intersection in the pipes. He glanced down each of the three possible routes. No lights, no audible sounds.
Brom!
He called.
Brom, you yellow-bellied horse's ass!
No response.
Damn it!
He spat, taking the left tunnel. The mayhem seemed diminished behind him. They too might have been confused by the intersection. Gus slowed, stemming his labored breath, listening out. Nothing seemed to be approaching.
That's that then,
he whispered, stalking along. He knew things were far from okay, however. Yanni was almost certainly dead. There was no indication that either Brom or Stephen were alive either. The hogs were still out, and he had no idea where in or under town he was.
Calm,
he told himself.
Calm down.
He had spare batteries for his headlamp, and the cool, damp conditions ensured he could last without water longer than normal. But the labyrinth was unyielding. His projections of hope and safety went unreciprocated. He was at the mercy of the underground. After several minutes of walking, Gus noticed a trickle of water running past his boots. The trickle soon turned into a small, steady stream, like the flow from a hose.
Rainstorm,
he realized.
Shit!
He worked his way up the pipe. He had to reach a safe spot. If the rain came down hard enough, he'd get swept away or drown. The stream became a torrent splashing past his shins. Gus pressed his palms over the side of the pipe for stability. His bracing wouldn't last forever. Heavily gushing water sounded off ahead. He followed a right angle in the pipe and saw a waterfall coursing from an opening in the ceiling. He just had to edge ahead past it. The water was soaking his knees. He dug his hands in, taking slow, low, shuffling steps. He could feel flecks of water from the falls hitting his face. He was underneath it, encased in it. He was soaked, his vision blurry. The air became cold and dry. No more water pushed at his legs. Gus sighed with relief, rubbing water out of his eyes. Readjusting his headlamp, he looked ahead. He was face to face with a hog, and suddenly Gus was on his back, sliding headfirst down a raging current, his forearms screaming with pain from the tusks that had gored him. At his feet, sliding down the rapids with him, was the beast's ravenous maw.
Shit!
He cried, his voice lost among the rushing water. The current had already pushed him down the pipe the entire length he had been arduously covered, and well beyond. The hog had taken to lunging forward, its snapping jaws flicking the tips of his boots.
No, no!
Gus shouted, drawing his hunting knife. With a rubbery crunch, the hog closed its mouth around Gus's left boot and yanked it off. It chewed it to a leathery pulp, spit it out, and resumed chase.
You fucking creature!
Gus bellowed, brandishing his blade. For a split second, he went airborne and fell into a deep, open pool. Instinct took over and Gus kicked off to the side, surfacing immediately. The hog came surging forth next, crashing into the water with a splash that sounded like cannon fire.
Die, motherfucker, die!
Gus yelled, jumping forward and stabbing it in the throat. The hog turned to bite him, but that only dug it further into its neck. Warm blood spurted onto his hands, contrasting wickedly with the cool water. It jumped, pushing him back against the wall, then collapsed, gurgling and twitching, the basin turning deep crimson from its wounds.
Got you. I got you.
Gus wheezed. The adrenaline had left his body. His forearms felt like they'd been shot. His joints ached. He leaned against the wall, catching his breath, seething as he rubbed his fingers across the puncture marks. Exhaustion hit him like a truck, and despite the rising water and imminent peril, he felt he could have let go and just fallen asleep in that cool, wet basin. Instead, he crawled up into the opposite pipe and pushed on. Find Brom and Stephen, kill the werepig, or get out alive, whichever came first.
Gus? Stephen? Yanni?
A quarter-mile west, Brahm's mantra echoed throughout the storm drains as he tore through the pipes. Before, he was certain his voice would carry far enough to be heard. Now there was a rushing noise coursing up the tunnels like a distant static. A storm had hit. Thankfully, not coursing through his section of pipes, but if the others were anywhere close, they'd be at the mercy of those floodwaters too.
Goddamn fucking bullshit,
he swore, stomping at the ground.
What did I tell them? Didn't I tell them this venture was a mite hasty? I did, didn't I? Now look at us, lost and confused and on our way to becoming pig slop. I didn't ask for this.
He kicked at a piece of refuse on the pipe floor.
Guess we all just had this coming, huh?
As he pushed on, he thought about what could have forced an entire megaherd of wild boar into the storm drains, and how they could even thrive down there. They had plenty of water. Duh, he told himself. And food wasn't out of the question, what with all the fish and other animals that washed down the pipes. But enough to feed all those big beasts? Plus the legendary werepig? Randy Duluth was far from the first victim. There had been others, at least dozens of others, in the years before. But they always found the bodies, never the perpetrator. Except for that one time. That horrible night on the beach, all those decades ago. The hogs that attacked them earlier had proven hungry already. Hungry enough to kill and devour.
It's them,
he realized.
It was always them. Always the hogs that we blamed on the werepig.
Theirs was truly a fool's errand. Yet ironically, the sobering truth gave him strength. Fresh resolve to find his way out of the storm drain and warn the rest of the town about their misbeliefs, that they had feral storm drain hogs to worry about instead. Pipe widened and led into an open space, wide enough to qualify as a room, yet barely tall enough to stand in. The sides were lined with concrete channels filled with water, and at the center of the cistern was carnage.
Jesus H. Christ,
Brom whispered, surveying it with his headlamp. It was a boneyard. Human skeletons, he could tell. Most of them cleaned of their meat, some still stuck with rotten gobs of flesh. Yet the longer he stared, the more he saw that while it was grisly and horrific, there just weren't that many. 10, maybe 12 skeletons at the most. Not enough to account for every disappearance. A good number, maybe, but definitely not all.
Maybe there is a werepig,
Brom hissed.
Lord help me, I'm so fucking confused.
From 2 other pipe openings in the cistern came the sounds of approaching swine.
Oh, fuck me,
Brom spat. Too late to try and turn back. He looked around and saw the concrete channels. He dashed over to the left side and lowered himself into it, submerging in cold, nasty water up to his chest. He ducked, eyes peering over the rim into the cistern. A porcine head emerged from a pipe. Brom fumbled with his headlamp and switched it off. It was complete darkness. Brom could hear their snuffling, their hoofbeats. He estimated at least 6 of the beastly fuckers. He could smell them too. Scat, blood, and musk, and raw pork. The sounds turned to crunching and slurping. Brom was grotesquely reminded of chicken dinners back home, cracking the bones open with his teeth to suck out the tasty, nutritious marrow.
At least they ain't wasteful,
he thought. He had to move on. Their snuffling snouts reminded him that he probably smelled a lot more appealing than old bones. He had to sneak past them, find a pipe entryway, and get out of there. Clopping hooves approached. Brom's ears sharpened. One of them was coming his way. He submerged, the water closing around the top of his head. He held his breath, daring not to make even the tiniest bubble. He could hear it above him, heavy, snorting grunts directly over his scalp. Skull-crushing death was a mere 4 inches overhead. Taking greatest of care, Brom inched to his left, not even letting the tips of his hair touch the surface. Something broke the surface to his right, followed by the sounds of thirst-quenching slurps. Brom quickened his pace, hoping the hog was sufficiently distracted. A good 10 feet further, he finally exposed his face to breathe. Sure enough, the hog sounded like it was lumbering off the joint its head made, water sloshing off its front. Brom hit a wall, the end of the channel. He emerged from the water, hugging the far side of the cistern, feeling for a pipe. Water dripped off of his clothes. The sounds of hungry hogs were insurmountable. His hands danced along the wall, feeling for a pipe. His fingers curled around an opening. So close to salvation. Searing pain shot against his forehead. His headlamp had shorted out and sparked. It flashed on for a second before sputtering out for good. That one glimmer of light revealed every hog in the room turning to look at him. He didn't even waste time shouting. He hauled himself into the pipe and ran for his life. The hogs weren't far behind. Barreling through the darkness was a nightmare made flesh. Brom had no idea what laid ahead. Intersection, dead end, catch basin. But the approaching wall of hungry, squealing mouths forced him to push on. The pipe turned right, and Brom saw a light ahead. He forced himself to run faster. He was going to make it. He burst into the sunlit room. His boot, making contact on the floor, gave way, and Brom tumbled in midair, flailing his arms. 1 second. 2 seconds. And suddenly, he was flat on his back, groaning in agony, unable to move his limbs. He must have fallen through an old grate into a lower section of pipes. Daylight sat above, taunting him. His spine felt torqued. No chance he was moving anymore. Around the opening 20 feet above, hogs' heads gathered, peering over the rim, staring down.
Get!
Brom jeered.
Get out of here! Fuck off!
The hogs jittered at the edge, as if daring themselves to jump.
Don't you even!
Brom choked, but he couldn't muster the strength to grab his knife. They seemed to hesitate, circling the opening, squealing and snapping at him.
Help!
He cried.
God damn it, help me! For the love of God, somebody, help!
One of the hogs reached a hair too far. It lost its balance and fell.
No!
Brom screamed.
Fuck!
It crashed into him, hooves and jaws tearing at flesh and shattering bone. The rest of the hogs plummeted down with their herdmate. Brom only knew the fear of being eaten alive for a few merciful seconds. Then the daylight above disappeared, along with his pain. Stephen was hopelessly lost, but he very much preferred being hopelessly lost in the sandhills, weighed against the storm drains. The sky had become overcast, yet the rich iron smell in the air and cluster of clouds to the southwest told him he was out of the rainstorm's path. He had felt a few drops, but the canopy of pine needles overhead had covered him nicely. He didn't feel safe, however. The sandhills had a hypnotic quality to them. So much open space, yet everything looked the same. Every tree was similar. The rolling yellow grass was nondescript, and the horizon was blocked by the occasional wall of gnarled shrubs. It was exactly the sort of psychological mind trap a werepig would call home. Queasiness overtook Stephen as he trudged through the forest. He imagined the werepig hiding out in the impenetrable woodlands, sneaking through the storm drains and popping out only to kill, just as easily as leaving the house for a fast food joint. Only one thing gave him reassurance, that civilization lay to the west. He scoped out the sun from behind the clouds and headed that way. Each step towards town, however, put him further away from the truth of finding his son's killer, of finding retribution for all those mangled souls. Heavy chains seemed wrapped around his ankles, rooting him to the ground, keeping him from truly departing this place. It wasn't just his son he was leaving behind. Gus, Yanni, Brom, who might have escaped already, or gotten themselves killed. He kicked a pine cone across the forest floor. He hated not knowing. The air had been filled with bird calls, but Stephen soon picked up a new sound: rushing water. He sighed. If the pipe was in his path, there'd be no reason to check it out. A few moments later, he came across a muddy ditch next to a hillside. A large concrete pipe, tall enough for him to walk through, emptied a copious stream of water into it. As far as Stephen could tell, the pipe extended far beyond his vision, deep into the storm drains. He rubbed the side of his head. Was it worth going back in? Bubbles formed at the surface of the brown water. Stephen watched them, numb from the trials he'd endured. He was sure after all he had gone through, nothing could scare him anymore. He was wrong. A child emerged from the ditch. His skin was pitch black, so much so it made the darkest night look gray. It almost hurt to look at. His clothes were ragged, faded and gray. Yet Stephen recognized the cartoonish dinosaur on the front of the shirt. He remembered getting Randy that shirt for last Christmas, his son's face glowing with joy. Velociraptors were his favorites ever since he first saw Jurassic Park. None of that joy was in his face. It wasn't his face at all. It was familiar still. Horribly familiar.
Do you like my new head, Daddy?
He cooed.
I found it down there. I'm sure Yanni won't be needing it anymore.
Stephen kept his gaze lowered.
You ain't my boy,
he muttered.
Well, I'm the closest thing you've got now, old man.
The thing snapped.
Why don't you come with me? There's nothing left for you up here.
Go to hell,
Stephen growled.
There is no hell,
the thing leered.
I would know. Now I said, follow me. Or you can go back home and let the mere thought of me kill you softly.
Slowly, Stephen's legs forced him forward. The apparition seemed to drift a millimeter above the ground, coursing up the pipe into the darkness. Stephen waded through the flooded ditch, clambering into the opening and following.
So,
the apparition said, luring him further into the gloom.
You believe the werepig killed me? I can understand that. It hurt really bad, Daddy. See?
It reached up with a snaking hand and removed Yanni's head from its neck. The face crumpled in its grasp like a plastic bag.
But death has given me vision that life only seeks to obscure.
Its voice rattled up from the hollow tube of its throat.
I know exactly what killed me, Daddy. Do you want to know?
It ain't my boy,
Stephen muttered again.
Well, you're right about that. But that's not important right now. It was a pig that killed me, Daddy. Just a plain old wild boar. The same ones that got Yanni and Brom and Gus. No werepig. There isn't one down here. I doubt there's even one at all.
No werepig,
Stephen echoed. He sank to his knees in festering despair.
All my anger for nothing.
Shh. The thing put its head back on. It was wrinkled and malformed like a bad clay sculpture. It walked up to Stephen, placing its hands on his shoulders.
Not for nothing. You tried. You tried to avenge me, Daddy. And you did a good job. Just not good enough.
Stephen shook his head.
I'm sorry for everything.
It's not your fault. You didn't know. There are things going on in this town leagues beyond your comprehension.
Things much greater than dead kids or a werepig. It leaned in closer, its warped face expressionless. Do you want to see them, Daddy? Stephen gagged. It was hard to breathe from grief, the horror of it all. But finally, he nodded. He wanted to know. He wanted it to be over with. The thing raised a hand and touched Stephen's forehead, and what he saw was enough. His limp, lifeless body slid down the pipe, splashing back into the flooded ditch, sinking from the weight of forbidden knowledge. At least he would rest in peace. Further south, down by the bay, the weather had just begun to let up. A small crowd had gathered at the end point of the main drainage pipe, which spilled out into the ocean. If any bodies, man, werepig, whichever, had dropped within the system of tunnels, they'd almost certainly wash out here. And if it was still alive and out for blood, they'd strike it down fast. The townsfolk bristled and waited. The noisy gush of water was all the pipe was willing to yield. Then, something came streaming down the frothing current. The crowd's voices rose in alarm as they raised their various weapons and lowered them again upon seeing who it was. He splashed into the seawater, and two men immediately rushed to haul Gus onto dry land. He was in horrible shape. His face was cut up and bruised, his eyes squinted tight against the outside light, and his forearms bore two ugly puncture marks. He refused to let go of his hunting knife as they set him down. He sputtered and coughed, pounding at his chest as the onlookers watched.
Gus, what did you see?
One inquired.
Did you get the werepig?
Another asked.
Where are the others? Where's Stephen Duluth?
Shut up,
Gus rasped, holding out a hand. They silenced immediately and backed away. Gus rose to his feet, feeling straight like a prophet about to deliver a sermon before the masses.
We ain't fucking with that shit again,
he declared.
There's a whole herd of wild boars down there that'll kill whoever sets foot in those pipes.
The crowd mumbled at this revelation, but he continued.
Don't even bother. And as for the werepig...
The gatherer silenced. He drew a breath. That monster's way too smart for us.
That monster's way too smart for us. All we saw was its vanguard. It was long gone and sent its goons to kill us instead.
They muttered again, lowering their weapons. Some backed away from the pipe as far as they could within earshot.
We lost too many good men today,
Gus said soberly.
Today, let's cut our losses and mourn. Tomorrow, we'll carry on and walk away as smarter folk.
And so, the crowds dispersed, infused with a bold new fear and respect for the Hell's Gulf werepig.
Chilling tales for dark nights.